Our universe is incredible, surrounded by mystery and beauty, and many of us have questions about our past, present, and future. October Hallam is an intuitive medium with over 20 years of experience. She has assisted people with discovering their path by understanding their past and connected the living to their loved ones who have made the transition. She is currently offering readings through Skype, Zoom, FaceTime, phone, and in person. You can reach her at theancientgift222@gmail.com. Welcome back to Forbidden Knowledge News. I'm your host, Chris Matthew. Hosting with me is October Hallam. Today our guest is Ari Asulin. Before we bring him on, a couple of announcements. Coming March 11th, 12th, and 13th, we got Forbidden Knowledge News Con. We're going to have 8 amazing presenters, and it's going to be online with a Rokfin premium membership. And that means you can get the entire conference for only $10. Just sign up through that link in the description. You're going to get access to not only the conference, but all our premium content and all the content from every creator on Rokfin. And you can always get new episodes free on Rokfin, Odysee, and all podcast platforms. Check out the podcasts we feature on the Forbidden Knowledge Network. You get those on our website. That's forbiddenknowledge.news. And be sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Those links are all in the description. Some of us just want to get through our day without having to wear a face diaper to go into the store, airport, or even work. Check out Fake Mask. Fake Mask has the most breathable and authentic-looking masks on the market, sure to get you into stores, on airplanes, and into work. Just click that link in the description. You're going to get 10% off your order. Today I want to welcome back to the show Ari Asulin. He is a hobbyist conspiracy researcher who explores alternative truth topics such as Saturnian cosmology, electric universe theory, mud flood and reset theory, and life on Mars. He also studies predictive programming in the media and how it may be decrypted to determine which truths are forbidden to us and which falsehoods have been passed as truth. Ari, welcome back. How are you?
Doing great. How you doing?
I'm doing awesome. Last time you were here, I think we barely scratched the surface of the most fascinating discussion. It involves hijacked history, fake timelines, massive global cataclysms, and the possibility of a off-planet breakaway civilization that controls the fate of our society. And, you know, with everything that has become truth that was once conspiracy lately, I don't doubt any of this stuff, and it's super fascinating. And that's kind of where I want to start today is really who and what this civilization was, where they're from, and how ancient are they, and how advanced were they. But, you know, where should we start with that?
At the beginning of the story, the origin story of Earth and all of the other planets in this solar system have been rendered by every indigenous religion in this world. Each religion remembers the memory from a different perspective with different conclusions and also different effects on their locality. Some people experienced cataclysm, some people didn't. So what am I talking about? Talking about Saturnian cosmology. Saturnian cosmology, which suggests that Earth and the rest of the planets were born in cataclysmic events, in rapid succession, in short order of time, not millions or billions of years, but actually in years. and that these events are more or less like how life births as well. Like it's a big violent process and then slow and steady stability afterwards. So the planets were all born in a violent process. This process was with the L-type brown dwarf system that later became Saturn, connected to our sun, and just kind of gave birth to all of our planets all at once. These stories were then passed down in myth, and as the myths hit us today, we don't understand them, like Kronos having all these children, gobbling up all the children, and then having one of the biggest kids, Zeus, or goes by many different names, coming out of the belly and saving all the other children. You know, these stories make no sense to us, but if they were planets following plasma physics, as described by the electric universe theory, then actually all of these myths make sense, every last one of them. The ones that depict horrible fathers, horrible mothers, unrealistic families, that family lines that really don't add up at the end of the day. And so that's the essentially the beginning, the origin story of Earth is passed on by these myths, and we've sort of rejected them and accepted this alternate cosmology, the one that's given to us by the science establishment. A lot of people don't realize that most of our science we have today, like NASA and so forth, actually came from the Vatican. People like Isaac Newton were high level in the Vatican, and they were extremely religious, pushing religious ideals at the time. Ideas that the planets were not created in short order, but actually created by God, and the hand of God actually wields everything throughout history from the beginning to the end. So we kind of have like the extreme religious version of monotheistic religious version where God did everything. Then we have polytheistic religions all over the world that say, we don't really know who's in charge of this. We just know what happened. For example, Indian culture has many thousands of gods. And so with Saturnian cosmology, we have this alternate explanation. Yes, it would happen in short order. Yes, it happened violently. Yes, it's very hard for the early humans to understand. But no, this was not an angry God. We don't have to continue to worship these guys in modern times. This is what Saturnian cosmology suggested, but also polytheism in the Eastern religions, in the Rus Horde Empire, Tartaria, Siberia, those locations, they push polytheism. Sorry, I'm getting all my terms mixed up today. And in that religion, in polytheism, there was no superior God. There was no sub-logos and logos above. There was just a bunch of deities that showed up in random order and then sort of fled the scene after a while. So you can see that there's a difference in opinion, a religious schism that sort of created it was found in Europe that fought over these two perspectives. One where God is doing everything and punishing us, and we have to sort of worship him. The other one that these events are completely natural and that there is no message to them except for the messages that we get. So sorry, I'm kind of rambling there, but that's sort of the just to cover a lot of stuff we talked about last time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I want to go back for a second to the Saturn cosmology of what the ancients kind of saw in the skies, based on a lot of accounts, was a lot different than what we're seeing now. Right. Is this based on that Saturn was in a different place and maybe closer to the Earth, and we saw it as our sun?
Right. In the Saturnian cosmology, all the planets were aligned in a collinear configuration, with Saturn and Jupiter being close to the sun, Saturn being the only thing we can see, with Jupiter being hidden behind it, and the sun being hidden behind Jupiter. So for all intents and purposes, all the light and energy and life was coming from Saturn in the origin story. So it actually makes sense that religions across the planet would still worship Saturn as the creator of what we thought was the universe back in the origin story.
So where does this kind of advanced society come in? I know that you have theories that they kind of started out on Mars, was it?
Right. So at the time in that collinear configuration, heaven was above, and Saturn, that was not a place you could stand. You could not go to heaven. That's why it was described that way. And the place you could stand, the highest place of all, was Mars. That was the only rock available to humans at the time. Above Mars was Venus, a plasma entity, and like I say, it can go there. So what they found at the very north pole of Mars was this completely idyllic, fantastic environment. One where a tremendous amount of amplitude energy flows through the ground, yet at a very low voltage that makes it very safe. And they can sort of invent and experience all technology right available in their face. It's not hypothetical. The energy is passing through the sky, hitting, passing through Venus, passing through Saturn. They see energy in its raw form, and they're able to harness it on the ground. They used gems, emeralds. They found out that these emeralds placed in the ground, they actually grow like fruit into large emeralds, and you can carve them back down into shapes and create entire structures out of them. We get all of our stories of Atlantis and these emerald cities from this origin story when all this technology was available and easy, and so to that point, there was no long invention of technology. There was no slow-paced harnessing of technology. It was all right there in the first 100 years, and there was no reason to build stuff like airplanes or computers, because you could fly, you could communicate with gems. There's no reason to build. Well, you get the point. It was a time when we didn't rely on technology to survive. So therefore, technology itself sort of attained its prominence early on during the Golden Age, and then after the Golden Age ended, all of this technology and knowledge was lost. Not only lost, but we couldn't even reproduce it anymore. With these emeralds and stuff, you can't reproduce that kind of energy because we don't have that energy flowing through Earth these days anymore. We're in the post-Cataclysm time now.
Well, right. Now, before I turn anything over to you, October, I want to know, what are your primary sources for a lot of this research and information?
I've totally started out with Immanuel Velikovsky, and I definitely recommend a starting place with him. In the early 20th century, he wrote Worlds in Collision and several other books, which are extremely groundbreaking and threatening to the establishment. They basically dispelled everything the establishment was pushing. And this was before Carl Sagan. In fact, Carl Sagan was what came out of the debate with Velikovsky. You can see that back in the 60s, they did not teach kids about stars and planets in school. This was, in fact, they didn't want anyone to know about these things back then. This was all within the religious context. And it was people like Velikovsky and even Sigmund Freud who came out with extremely threatening statements. Freud said Moses must have been an upper class of the Egyptian empire. He could not have been, a slave. It's impossible. So people kept saying stuff like that in the early 20th century and suggesting that the Vatican, they're not telling us the origin story as they want, as it really is. They're telling it to serve their purpose of power, control, and to make us believe that everything was God's will. So I start with Velikovsky, and I go into modern people like David Talbot, who made that video in 1995 depicting the Saturnian cosmology from the beginning until the breakup, and that just the visual depiction of the planets really gives you the impression of how it works. If we don't see these simulations, we'll never understand what Saturnian cosmology is trying to tell us.
Right on. October, any questions?
Sure. I guess the first question I have, listening, because Ari went pretty fast. I was trying to take notes. That's okay. Where do the gods come from in your theories? I mean, you were mentioning like the gods and the pantheons of like Greek and Egyptian and things like that. If we do look at all those stories, even the Norse, there are a lot of similarities between the hierarchy of the gods and what their responsibilities and powers, so to speak. So I've always thought that there was some kind of link, supposedly because back in the day we couldn't travel around the world. And how are all these different ancient societies coming up with, this basically
Right.
These origin stories and this hierarchy and these gods and the abilities that they all have. So, and Tartaria for me is something very, very new. I'm a historian. I don't know if you know that. I'm graduating here soon with my history degree.
Nice.
And going on for my master's. And I'm not doing it because I necessarily believe in mainstream academia, but it does teach you how to research, and it does teach you a lot about the written history that we are being taught. So for me, it's important for me to understand that as I go forward. So
Absolutely.
I wanted to give you a little bit of background, where my background is. But so where do these gods come from? Where are they and where do they go? What happens?
Absolutely. So a lot of people get confused looking at, say, Sumerian tablets. They're like, oh, look, there's giant humans and they must be gods. And there's a symbol in the sky that must be God. We get easily confused by symbology here, especially with the Vatican controlling all of our artifacts. So just to look at it point blank, what it is, well, we do see giants and small people. And that is because there were many giants in the origin story. In fact, there were the biggest humans of all back then and the smallest humans of all living at the same time. The different planets in the collinear configuration did evolve different speeds because they had different energies being received. If you lived on the south pole of Mars, you would be at Jotunheim, known in Norse mythology. You would grow into a giant human due to the incredible energy in that region, and yet it would be a very cold, frozen region at the same time. Hard to understand, but it's explained, through Saturnian cosmology. So to on that point, where the rest of the gods come from, if the small humans are just humans, and the gods can be defined as a deity that goes through this sort of social story that's quite beyond our realm. We cannot interact with them, and they influence us, but they're not here on the ground. They're literally logos level. That means that you have to differentiate, what God is. It's not a human ever. It's not a walking, person on the ground that had, great prominence or a lot of people respected him or anything like that. No, gods have special characteristics. They cannot die. They gobble up each other and they spit each other out. They don't have sensible lineages. So there is only one object out there in this story that follows those patterns, and those are the planets. Each planet was seen in the sky in close proximity by everyone on Earth. And it didn't matter if you lived on one side or the other side of the planet, you saw the same story. And if you didn't see the complete story, you saw a perspective, enough of it to tell, where you thought your origin story came from. In the north side of the planet, we saw the Saturn collinear configuration with Venus, Mars, Saturn, Jupiter. On the south side, we saw Uranus, Neptune. I don't believe Pluto is a real planet, and Mercury. And these three planets formed this huge stickman figure in the sky with immense heat, and it sort of made it hard to live down there. So a completely different story, but the same collinear configuration. This stickman figure was not a deity that the Aztecs worshipped. It was simply something they saw in the sky and they wrote down on the rocks. So to answer the question, every single god in mythology actually can be traced back to a planet. And even in the cases when it's not a planet, like as some associated with storm and lightning, for example, like Zeus is, you can actually backtrace the storm and lightning, the cause of it, to the local influence of the planet Jupiter on Earth, causing that storm and lightning. So every time the gods in mythology trace back to actual planets close to Earth in close proximity, causing cataclysm.
Very interesting. Anything else before we move on from that?
One other point of that, one thing I'll say about that real quick, Greek and Roman mythology, this is one thing that if you ask any of those guys who study this, they're very paranoid about accepting that the Greek and Roman gods completely line up in their pantheon. In fact, they all line up perfectly except for the one Roman god of Janus, the gatekeeper god. That's the only one that doesn't line up. So that's a complete match. And for some reason, modern historians are phobic of suggesting that they could have had the same origin mythology due to the religious schism that still exists in Europe.
Well, I'm not an expert on pantheons of gods anywhere. I know I have basic, knowledge of them, obviously, from the studies I've done. But to me, the Romans ripped off the Greeks to form their pantheon because they basically, adopted the Greek culture later. I mean, there's the Greek revival, right? With Alexander the Great, he's credited for Western civilization. So, it's not a far stretch to see how close they are and why. But right. That's not the show today. Who coined the term Saturnian? Is that how do you say it?
Saturnian.
Saturnian. Who coined that Saturnian cosmology phrase?
Before Immanuel Velikovsky, I don't know if anyone else has said it. So I would say he did it.
Yeah, that's the first I've heard of it as well.
What is he like? I wrote it down, so I'm gonna check it out. But I'm gonna get the book. But where does he come up with this information? I mean, was this a download? Was this something that he, in his studies, what was his background? How did
I can actually identify with him because he came from a religious background where he studied the religious texts in detail. If you know the early 20th century, these texts are forbidden. If you're a woman, for example, you could not read the Torah for a long time there. So when this guy studied these texts in detail, he came up with a different conclusion than everyone else does. Everyone else like, oh, it's all God. And he said, wait a second, these can be traced back to physical cataclysm. And why? Because he was atheist. He didn't believe that the God explanation was good enough, and he looked for something else.
Interesting. And what was his background? Was he a historian, a scientist?
That's a good question. And I used to actually know a lot more facts on him.
I'm just, as you're in school, I think too. So you always want to check sources, right? So I'm trying to, and I'll check it out myself. I was just curious, because anybody can come up with any kind of theory, but it doesn't mean that there's any validity to it, right? So
Yeah,
I just was curious, like who is he?
Yeah, I've never seen him be called Jewish. I've never heard Velikovsky being called that, but he is Russian and he is Israeli and he studied the Torah. So it doesn't matter to me if he's Jewish or not. This guy was deep into that stuff. I had to study the Torah when I was a kid. And when you do it in detail from a rabbi, you sort of get this impression that this isn't a joke. These guys really believe in this testimony. This is serious stuff. So when I went through that without being theist afterwards, I did the exact same thing he did. I had to look for a different explanation than that one for all of this testimony, because his testimony is very compelling. The stuff about the Exodus, it looks like you can't make it up. It looks like a real story. We just have to explain where it came from.
Mm-hmm.
Now, earlier you mentioned that you don't think Pluto is a planet. It seems that astrology plays a huge role when it comes to the outlook in determining not to say future events, but future energies and things that may come to pass that you can kind of time by the sky clock, if you want to say. Do you think that astrology is a major part of what this kind of breakaway civilization used to kind of go off of what they were planning for future events?
Yes, I do believe that astrology is a religion, and it represents the foundation of all religion that we know today. It might sound weird, but astrology is beneath Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. It's right there in the Old Testament. People that believe in astrology believe in constancy, the idea that things stay the same for a very long time. When I read Fomenko's version of history, his new chronology, his description of the Rus Horde Empire and what they went through, every single stage of their evolution made sense to me. One of the big stages reflected in Western Scalagerian history as Constantine converting the Roman Empire over to Christianity is actually a moment when he converted everyone over into constancy. And that means that he said, here's the new calendar, this Julian calendar that we're pushing. This calendar is fixed year, fixed moon, going back to antiquity. In other words, they were erasing this idea that there was ever this cataclysmic origin of story of Earth and replacing it with a constant, gradual story. Even back then, even in the Constantine days, to me, that was the making of a real nefarious religion. This is not an accident. Somebody was attempting to control religion on Earth by making everyone worship the zodiac. The zodiac, it's like, oh, it's so harmless, so whatever. Well, let me tell you, the zodiac spawned the Jesus story. Every single step of his tale is actually a zodiac sign. Not his original story, not the true story, but I'm talking about the one written in the Bible today. It's actually just a zodiac encryption. And then who else? King David, the king of the Jews. This is a big deal that this guy never existed, and that his entire story is based on images of constellations on the zodiac. He went to the water bearer, he slept with these women. None of these things happened or matter to anyone. So we shouldn't be worshiping the zodiac, if you follow me. And we certainly shouldn't think that the zodiac religion represents the real religions of this planet. They do not. They represent redacted, sort of controlled, Latinized Renaissance religions.
Right. So, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
So I guess my big question is, I'm listening to you and I'm trying to wrap my head around it, because this is a huge, a huge difference in what I've believed and learned in my research. But
totally.
So in your opinion, I guess this is a two-part question. Who and why created Catholicism and the Vatican? And in your opinion, from that point that was created, do you believe that we have de-evolved as a species?
Catholicism means mass, right? It means we're all collecting in a huge mass of humans in faith. That sounds like a plan, right? A scheme that someone wanted that to happen when they created Catholicism. There was always been an order that worshipped religion in that way, the one that said, come to our church and we're in charge and the priests represent God. You can find that all the way back in the beginning of human modern civilization, which I believe started 1,000 years ago. That's the new chronology, starts 1,000 years ago rather than 2,000. During that first 100 years, there were no empires, there was no warfare, there was barely any civilization or cities or anything like that on Earth. This is just after the Cataclysm. We're finally able to start building and moving around the planet. So it didn't take very long for there to be some kind of schism, and it took 100 years. But he describes this European schism forming around this character Andronicus Christ, who threatened monotheistic religions so broadly that it basically reverberates in that religion today. I won't get too much into that story, but there's an Eastern version of the Jesus story that was completely erased. In fact, his name did not have letter J in it because the Cyrillic alphabet does not have that letter. His name was Andronicus Christ, and he was the first emperor of the Rus Horde Tartarian Empire that would later be created in his name. Now he didn't actually go around creating an empire, but due to the events of his life, which I won't get into, they were they had such an effect on people around them that they basically formed empires, formed cities, Alexandrias, as they're called, around the world, pushing his narrative, essentially. Now, we think that's the Alexander story, right? This is where Fomenko points out that Scaliger may have, or some Western historian may have redacted one story, duplicated over and over into many others. When up to the point when Jesus is crucified, that is the official Jesus story as written in the Bible, heavily redacted. After the crucifixion, that story becomes Alexander and Muhammad of the Islam faith. It's the same character reflected in a different way, more militaristic. Now this guy is traveling to other countries, which we didn't think Jesus ever went to, and he is founding cities, creating an empire. It's the rest of the Jesus story that we don't talk about in Western civilization, which really leads me to believe that Jesus was not killed on the cross. He was crucified as a form of punishment. But if he really was a giant human, not the small-sized human, then he didn't die that day. He went on to form the empire. And that one moment created this Western versus Eastern religious Orthodox schism that lasts till today. And that's where, to get to the question, is Catholicism a bad thing? Well, I'll tell you what's bad about it. The Catholics all came from the Rus Horde Empire in Siberia, in the East, far beyond the Kremlin. They did not come from Italy. They're kind of living an illusion, a Scaligerian Romanov illusion that the Roman Empire existed in Italy. And it didn't. A small vassal state did exist in Italy and Spain and many other regions there. It was part of a world empire at the time. And when that world empire fell apart, 1775, due to its inability to rule itself, the aristocracy fell apart. Some regions declared independence. America did, 1776. Other regions did not. And some regions like England, for whatever reason, decided to pretend that they actually were that empire going back 1,000 years, that all of those kings that were their kings actually in England. We don't see evidence of any kind of kingdom in England. We see a lot of castles, sure, but not a kingdom. And they're just my point is that as the Protestant movement represented all of Western Europe, and the Inquisition movement actually came from the East, that means that the whole Protestant versus Catholic schism is actually, it's fake. It represents the real schism of East versus West, where the West completely won and erased and stole all of the history of the East, renamed the locations and the people, and then went further. They stole all of the history of Africa and all their people too. And we see today the Old Testament is actually a combination of both histories. All this stuff from Africa about the Exodus, which happened in Africa, and then all this stuff about Esther and the king, which happened in the Kremlin. So these are stories that have been ripped apart and reorganized by the Western historians.
Now, this is apparently a massive undertaking and something that would have had to have been agreed upon by some global elite society.
Right. Yeah.
Now, where do they originally come in? And you were talking about this off-planet society. Did they originally come from Mars? Are these the ones that we're talking about?
Well, I definitely believe humans were on Mars since the origin of Earth. They've always been there. They've had very hard time living there. It's scarce resources, limited water, so forth. Very, very cold. They have been wanting resources from Earth this entire time, ever since they broke away. And the technology that they have is only a few hundred years ahead of us. It's not like ancient aliens or anything. It took them a long time to get those UFOs and all that, flying saucers, which only appeared in the 18th century. And before that, they had very limited control over us. They had just one big tool, telepathy. Anytime the Earth and Mars are in proximity, when our electromagnetic fields bump against us, we have the ability to do telepathy. Telepathy, I believe, represents the causality of every vision that's written in our literature, in our testimony. Stuff like Joan of Arc. There's no reason to doubt that Joan of Arc saw a vision and got instructions from somebody to commit warfare. You got to ask, why would some deity or saint want humans to fight? I don't know, but I do know why Martians would. They want us to fight so that they can control us. And it seems to me that from the Crusades to the Reformation versus the Inquisition, leading up to modern wars, every single war was designed to keep them in charge of us at the end of the day. Not a single war in this world can be logically explained. Not World War II, forget about that one. Not World War I, where no one knows exactly why we even, fought just because someone was assassinated. The Civil War, which everyone fights about today, which the real truth of the Civil War is completely different from what they say it was. A huge army from the North invading, shock and awe campaign. And before the Civil War, the Revolutionary War, which was hardly a war at all. It was just a bunch of hill battles, and it had some crazy facts to them, like the tornado that saved George Washington in the Battle of DC. Go look it up. Huge tornado / hurricane shows up and destroys the British Army and throws their cannons into the sky. This is in our literature. It's not a conspiracy. It's just we have to explain what these events really mean. What I'm saying is that they want us to believe warfare is just a human element. It's just something that we do, and it is not. It is something not in our nature at all. It's very, very hard to convince us to actually go to war. That's what I think.
Very interesting.
Is this what they call Mars retrograde? When Mars is in retrograde, when the electromagnetic fields get close, when they say, "Oh, don't make any major business decisions or anything,"
that's Mercury retrograde.
No, you're right.
Right. You know what I'm saying? Like, is that like Mars retrograde? Because that's like
absolutely right. There's a huge controversy there. The scientists will laugh at you and say, "We explained retrograde a long time ago. It's nothing." They can't explain it. There's a weird bump in the orbit of Mars. When it gets close to us, it bumps, and the same thing happens with Mercury. So the retrograde can only be explained by electromagnetic influence of the planets on each other. That means they're sort of squeezing at moments in their orbit and then pushing away. I'm going to tell you one story about Mars, which sounds totally ludicrous, but this one researcher has studied 200 years of stock market history and decided that there is always a big pulse of stock market trade lasting about a month every time Mars is in proximity to Earth, going back 200 years. Without him making any conclusions, it really looks like they've been betting on our stock market for 200 years, So there's just a lot of reasons to believe that, yes, there's life on Mars. Yes, they severely care about what happens and influences affairs on Earth politically, money, religion, all of those tools are actually their invention, systems of control. It's not how we would ever have preferred it. It certainly isn't how things were done in the past.
You mentioned that the Civil War was not what we're told it was. What can you tell us about that? That might be more true to reality than what we're being told.
Right. Well, basically, everyone says Civil War is about racism, and it was inevitably that people were racist and led to war, either in retribution or for the purposes because they wanted slavery or they didn't, basically. And now, in reality, we have this repopulation of Earth that occurred during that time. Now, that's not even talking about the mud flood event or the reason for it. This happened for sure. It's called the orphan trains. You can look it up. Orphan trains were created all over Europe and America and China, like everywhere, and Australia in the 19th century, early 19th century, for the purposes of bringing just an unlimited supply of orphans into these cities, which for some reason were empty, to repopulate them. That happened. Now, why it happened, we can get to that later. But the more important thing is this led to civil war. Very, very simply, you can look up the instructions for these orphan trains by the societies that created them. The instructions are explicit. They say, if you have a white baby, you bring them to North America. If you have a black baby, bring them to south of North America. They will work in the plantations. It says that in the orphan train letters. So those orphan trains created all of that segregation that we were told led to the Civil War. It was not some greed or anything like that. It wasn't even a slave trade. It was literally the orphan trains and their instructions. And then 60 years later, after these orphan trains have completed their mission, you have a population in the South of Black people who get liberated by a population of soldiers from the North. you can see that they could have completely avoided this by just not segregating people by color with these orphan trains. So that's what I'm saying. The orphan train reality undoes the racist premise that they give us for that civil war, and just every other war in history is not what it seems.
Where did the orphans come from?
Good question. So that's the most interesting thing to me is I've never heard of this mud flood theory until about 9 months ago. And I've heard every conspiracy theory. I thought I heard them all. This one is just not out in the open until recently. It's a wide open field. Mud flood means that we find buildings that have been covered by mud all over the planet. We don't know why they're covered, and we don't know why everyone covered up the memory of it. They didn't leave behind a sign that said, "Oh, that building hydraulic, drilling are bad. We're not going to do that mistake." There's nothing to this memory, nothing. So it occurs to me that the memory was actually, this event, regardless of why it happens, it was definitely some sort of reset of our civilization. And during that reset, they had the ability to tell us changes in our actual history, and we would not know better. But it would take us forever to figure it out. So did they do it? Yes, I do believe they did it. More importantly, how do you lie about history? How is it possible to actually, to reorganize things without people finding out? And I think at the end of the day, there's certain rules that you have to follow. You cannot make up stories. They're impossible to make up stories that could possibly compare to the real stories. You can't. In other words, you have to lie about when it happens and where it happens. You can never lie about how it happens. And so all they actually did to redact history to add 1,000 years was to duplicate stories from the present and push them into the past. Another little primer that I've been operating on is that if you push stories into the present and the past, the reason why you would do that is stories that make you look good, you push them into the present. Say, oh, that recently happened. We built all this stuff, cathedrals and music. And things happened in the past, like, the Aztecs conquered the Mayans. We're going to push that back into the past, 800, 1,000 years or even more, so that we can't possibly be blamed for that, even though it happened or possibly did happen in the early 19th century. See what I'm saying?
Wow, so they're just kind of reorganizing the time scale
to hide their crimes. It's all about hiding crimes.
Well, where did the orphans come from, and who made the decision of allocating black babies for slavery and white babies for privilege?
Well, in these letters assigned the society each time, some kind of orphan society that organized the orphan trains. Why it happens? Well, the only real war happening at the time was the Napoleonic Wars. And if you estimate the amount of soldiers lost in that war, about 1 million, you can see that maybe that's where the orphans came from. But I think that this orphan train memory could not be explained by a single war alone. This more or less seems to me like everyone in those cities died and they had to be replaced by orphans. So that's the other part of this. Those cities didn't have anyone in them before the orphans showed up. Otherwise, they wouldn't need to move them in such a way to repopulate. Now, that's if you accept the mud flood theory as it is, which shows that there's a lot of abandoned cities, a lot of buildings that were covered up and could not have been lived in. So we can see that either these cities were abandoned for a while, and that after 40 years or whatever, when they cleaned everything up, they started repopulating them. That could be the reason for all the orphan trains beyond the Napoleonic Wars.
Let's talk a little bit more about the mud flood event itself.
Yeah.
This was supposedly a global, worldwide cataclysm that flooded the planet with some sort of mud. And there's different theories. Some people believe it actually came from outer space.
Right.
Some believe it was maybe a nuclear war or a comet hit the planet. I'd like to get your theory on, was this man-made or was this a natural event?
I'm sure it's man-made, because if it was natural, then we'd still be looking for it and be like, hey, remember that when that happened? We hope it doesn't happen again. Instead, we say asteroids, and we depict asteroids quite differently as a very different event. Asteroid, covers up the sun and then all the plants die. But in this event, this mud flood event, you got all this mud, right? I mean, where the hell did it come from? That's the first question to ask. I would say the real first question to ask is, where did all the energy come from to move all that mud? If it was a space event, natural event, I think we would be looking for it in the present, and we're not. So that I think we just rule that out. We're not looking for it. It was something that was man-made, that was covered up, a memory that we don't want to talk about, period. So I go straight to why it would happen. It seems to me that this event, the mud flood, followed the Napoleonic Wars. It also seems to me that Napoleon lost in the Kremlin in such a way that does not make any sense. That war made no sense. He should have won, and that he more or less had the upper hand ideologically, religiously. He had everyone in the world on his side back then. He had no reason to even think he was going to lose, kind of thing. It was just such an obvious reversal. When Napoleon lost, everything that we know in modern day was set in motion. Everyone that ever allied with him realized that they never should have allied with him in the first place. We get these stories: hear no evil, see no evil, speak no evil. Right? Where does that come from? From 200 years of people avoiding people like Napoleon, like Hitler, like Trump. When they show up, when they say, "Here's the revolution, it's really happening," and they say, "I don't hear anything, I don't see this," those guys were rewarded when Napoleon went down, for sure. When the Tsar of Russia, when he was speaking of the defeat of Napoleon, he was actually trying to convince his own people that it was not a divine intervention, because all the people were saying it was. If you look at Europe, every single aristocracy in the 19th century had the same slogan: God save the king, God save the queen. Every one of them. For some reason, they all believed the same thing, that God had intervened and defeated Napoleon, and that he actually, influences events today. So back to the mud flood. It does really seem to me like the mud flood is what made everyone believe that God had showed up again. Here's, the sky closes up and falls, lightning hits everything and destroys everything. It kills all of God's enemies, all of Napoleon's allies, the giants, for example, of America. They all become instantly petrified. They have nowhere to hide. This could only be depicted as God's will. If you lived in a cathedral, you would have survived it, because the cathedrals, which are designed as cathodes, where I get the name from, are harnesses for electricity. They can actually protect you during an incredible cataclysmic lightning storm. And so again, people that hid in the cathedrals were vindicated for their faith. I could go on all day about that, but it does seem to me that that was not an accident to make it seem like God had showed up and defeated Napoleon. That was actually on purpose, that someone designed it that way to look that way. They didn't want advanced technology showing up in tripods and lasers, because that would give their technology away. They had to use something that looked like God. My hypothesis is basically the mud flood energy events, because I'm looking for the energy, right? It doesn't matter to me what type of device was constructed. All that matters to me is that it's absolutely possible for one planet in close proximity to another one to release a tremendous amount of energy all at once that is received by that other planet. And we know what happens. In the cataclysmic origin story of Earth, you have mountains forming and craters, planets being ripped apart. These are extremely powerful forces, plasma energy and so forth. And when they hit Earth, they scarred Earth in such a way that created essentially the landscape we know today. Before the 19th century, we saw a different map of the Earth. That is not conspiracy again, that is a fact. Historians say this other map must have been a mistake by early cartograph technology that was not accurate. But there's some big mistakes in the graph. For example, the island of California. In the 18th century, many maps show California as an island with a clear ocean in between. Also, there's complete absence of a Grand Canyon. There is no Grand Canyon in the 18th century. It's not there. You actually have a few testimonies from Spanish travelers who never saw Grand Canyon and traveled right through that location. You see also European travelers who say they saw the Grand Canyon. Fine. I do believe that they'll always find that testimony if they need to. But the point is, you have to reckon with these maps. For some reason, there was no Grand Canyon, and California was an island. And then a century later, California is merged, fused into the continent. And there's this Grand Canyon lightning scar that goes all the way through Utah up into Colorado. Colorado also, huge mountains forming in dendritic patterns that do not appear in any previous maps. In India, you have the Himalayan mountains, this huge just pushing down of this mountain region. Does not appear in old Indian maps. You instead see these old cities, fabulous cities that used to exist in India, like Shangri-La, for example, which has now become mythical because we can't find it because it's been completely destroyed. Just pull out Google Earth and look at the Himalayan mountains, and you'll see there's something really weird about their shape. The official explanation, it's a thrust fault from a continental drift collision in the prehistoric times. But just really think about the Himalayas and try to imagine that thrust fault forming, and you'll realize this is not a thrust fault. This is like a heat scar. It's the land melted and got pushed downward and then froze as it cooled. Take a look at it and you might see what I'm talking about there. So to the point, there's a lot. Mud flood is a wide open topic. There's all these contradictions available to study. There is no answer yet. So that's why I had to jump immediately to my conclusion, because I know in my research, I'm very convinced that there were humans on Mars, that they had been influencing our affairs this whole time. And then when things go bad for them, when Napoleon turns the Jesuit plan on itself and frees everyone from this monotheistic religion, that they have no way to reverse it except for to destroy him and every one of his allies. So that's the conclusion that I settled with. And then I found all this other evidence, like, predictive programming and The Simpsons showing us a laser. They're captured by aliens on Earth and they build this huge laser as slaves and they shoot it at another planet. They're telling us these things. It also shows up in old fiction, like I can't remember the names. Those 1940s shows. A laser from another planet is in a lot of our fiction. It's even in Star Wars. So they're kind of showing it to us in a way that we swallow, and then we would never believe it. If anyone would, like, I come here and I tell you, yes, a laser might have been used on Earth in the past, they'd be, oh yeah, right, like Star Wars, right? So predictive programming is extremely effective to continue to cover up this memory.
To me, because I've always been fascinated with the legend of Atlanteans, Atlantis. Yeah. So to me, like the laser, I don't know so much if it's like our technology we have now. If you were to take somebody 1,000 years ago and show them this computer screen that we're talking across the country, or lights in a house, or plumbing, a toilet flushing, they would think it's magic. So I don't necessarily think that a laser. I think back like the Atlanteans in my research, what I've come up with is that they were able to utilize all of their senses, including their pineal gland, their sixth sense, and they could definitely utilize the energy through crystals. And I believe that a laser would be equivalent to them focusing and harnessing an energy through a crystal to achieve whatever, whether it was to light up the civilization, or, to, I don't know, whatever, to power up a flying vehicle, whatever that would be, they were able to do that. So just because it's not modern technology doesn't mean that it's not high technology. And I think as a historian, when I go back, because I'm listening to you and I'm trying to have an open mind. And that's, one of the things as a historian, we
appreciate it.
Try not to have our bias, a personal, because right now I'm listening to you and I'm going, okay, well, what about the Sumerian cuneiform tablets? We're talking, Genesis, who talks about, basically the book of Genesis in the Bible, about how life began. That's 6,500 years ago. So according to you, civilization's only been around for 200 years, or I'm sorry, 1,000 years or 2,000 years?
Modern civilization, 1,000 years. The whole origin of Earth, probably about 4,000 years total.
So, okay. So when we're talking civilizations, and I mean, okay, the mythical underwater city of Dwarka, India, mythical, right? Didn't, it doesn't exist. Well, recently they found it. It's dated to 9,500 to 12,000 years ago, which if you looked at the great deluge, that would line up with estimates of that. And of course we have, LiDAR technology, carbon dating, all kinds of technology out there now that, scientifically dates, different things. Of course, you can't date stone, right? That's why I think a lot of the ancient people, you have the Easter Head Islands behind you, use stone to kind of carve out their memory. And when you talked earlier about burying, why would they bury anything? Well, I mean, let's look at history, right? The Dead Sea Scrolls, they were hidden in a cave. Why? Because they knew that they had, foreign enemies coming that were going to burn or destroy all of their history. Göbekli Tepe, purposely buried, dated 12,600 years ago, approximately, right? So we're talking about these civilizations that I'm not saying that you're wrong, and I'm not saying that your theory can't line up with history, right? What I'm saying is, I think it goes back even further, though. Like you're talking specifically about Tartarian, right? You're not talking about Atlantis, which I really don't know a lot, so I can't say. But from everything I've read and studied and listened to Chris's show and other shows about Tartaria, because it fascinates me, honestly, fascinates me. I truly believe, and the stuff and the studies I've done on Atlantis, I truly believe that they come from Atlantis. Some kind of a remnant, fringe populace that survived whatever cataclysm struck Atlantis and destroyed it.
Right.
And I think that Atlantis may, and this is just a theory, have derived from Mars.
Yes.
So I that's kind of where like I've been reading and, you know, kind of like going back through history and listening and studying and just kind of, what do you think about that?
Well, I think, Ari, you and I talked about this last time. I asked you what you thought about, carbon dating and things that were dated for thousands and thousands of years ago. Yeah, go ahead. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, yeah, and I'd love to hear a historian's opinion on this. Just starting from scratch, if you were to start from scratch and try to prove to somebody that something is a certain age, artifact or building, and your evidence was mostly going to be carbon dating, which, assuming that you could do it correctly, would show an accurate date based on carbon dating technology as it stands today. And then also referential stuff, like you have, some library that still exists, has a book still exists that says that these people are real, that kind of thing. What do you believe is a non-controversial piece of evidence, something that could not possibly be forged or made fraudulent? Do you believe that carbon dating is that technology, or do you believe that they could essentially be lying about the scale of carbon dating?
You're asking me this question?
Yeah.
I will say that science, and this is not, I'm not bagging on science, okay? I think it's great. But it has known to be wrong. So yeah. I think we have to take everything that they say, like when I had 5 grown children, when my kids were babies, they said, put them on their side, don't put them on their back, never put them on the back. And then now, there's a new science out there saying, oh, you should put them on their back or you should put them on their stomach, which we were told never to do. So what I'm saying is we like evolve, right? We learn, and new science comes out with new studies. And
new science has become a culty joke, but that's just my opinion.
But
that's a good point, Chris, though. Good point.
But and that's true, and that's where I was headed. Thank you, Chris, for the segue. It also depends on who's paying for the study.
Right.
Because I just read 2 articles. One supports the ice cap melting, right, on Antarctica, and the other one saying that it's not, that right. The CO produced in the atmosphere is a natural occurrence that happens, and we go through cyclical periods on Earth of cold snaps and, glaciers melting and then reforming. Right. So, but then you look at who paid for these studies and you're like, okay, well, nice kitty. That makes sense, as to, why these scientists are coming out. So this is like where I'm trying to get my historian brain to not have bias when I'm listening to this. Right. I am not saying at all that our history books, I have very strong revelations and thoughts about like written history, what we consider history.
Right. Go
ahead.
Let me just, I was posing that question because I want to categorize the different pieces of evidence that we have for historical reference. And one of them is carbon dating. The other one is, much more reasonable like books and stuff that people are actually there and saw it. I would say one of the only references we have, like say in the Old Testament, is a lineage. This person begat that person. And without those people telling us who their parents were, we would have nothing,
It's pretty convenient that the Vatican ordered record keeping of births and death and marriages.
Yeah,
because then you can go back and write. And of course that could all be forged or changed or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. But that's the only thing we have. So we use that. So in Bach Saga, for example, we got these 2 histories. One of Bach Saga, the actual family, and it's like this guy, that guy, ancestors, going back 1,000 years, very fascinating, detailed. And then this whole other history about 30,000 year younger Dryas. And my first question always is, wait a second, your book says your family history in great detail. It does not show 30,000 years in great detail. We don't have the day-to-day over 30,000 years. So it occurs to me that any kind of estimate of thousands, 10,000s, 100,000s is never going to have the critical evidence to back it up, which is the day-to-day references, some textbook that wrote down every day, every year, or every person, or whatever it takes to get us to believe that this really happened. Instead, we have people saying, we believe that this rock shows carbon decaying at a certain rate. And if we look at carbon in other rocks, see at the rate of their decay, we can estimate how old the rock is. That's just the weakest argument of all. And I think once you rule out carbon dating, you see how really just kind of shoddy our history is. It's based entirely on who has access to the artifact. And every time we talk about artifacts, there's just another layer of controversy. Where do we seize artifacts? Oh, in the British Museum. Where do they get them? From China. So we have to trust the British that they weren't lying, that they stole the artifacts from China, which they stole and committed a crime at the time, and that the artifacts are real. This is a lot of layers of trust, and it is not a verifiable history at all. It's just what the historians tend to use. We found the artifact, therefore we are the authority to this truth.
So are you saying in the Tartarian theory that your Tartarian theory, maybe personally, is that we've just been around for 1,000 years and that's it on the earth, like humans, that's it. And we derive from Tartarian and we've been completely, so our ancient or innate memories have been basically washed away. And now we're controlled by a central, like elite, group of people, whether it's a family or an organization, whatever. And that, so you're saying like Sumerians didn't exist or ancient Egyptians didn't exist, or
Sumer's location, right? They existed. They have tablets that survived. Most artifacts did not survive, but they did. And they hold them up high and they say Sumerian tablets prove that these guys existed at this age. Well, how do you know it was 3,000 years ago? We don't have any proof of that part. There isn't a record from then till now. So we're trusting the historians because they have access to these artifacts that the Sumerians were the most ancient of our races, rather than just another place on Earth. There are many places, many names, all existing at the same time, not in order, not ordinal, but in the same time. I guess what I'm really concluding is that the history that they give us is quite insulting to me as a human. I do not believe that humans spent hundreds of thousands of years with sticks and stones just to evolve everything that we know in the last 200 years of technology. This is way too slow. And as for your question of, do I believe that this society is ruling us right now? That sounds too recent too. No, that can't be it. It has to be that they've always been ruling us. And the explanation comes from Atlantis, where Atlantis was sort of the center of reality back in its day. It took a fall. And then those people who were in charge of the world back then, they didn't want to lose control. They wanted to keep it going. And so those Atlanteans...
They controlled Atlanteans then.
Well, the Atlanteans, the highest of technology, the most elite, the ones pushing, say, democracy and stuff, they called themselves the Tree of Knowledge. They did not share this technology with the rest of the species. Otherwise, we'd be living in a very different reality. They suppressed it, and every single technology that we know today, from airplanes to computers, has some sort of horrible suppressed technology in it. These computers, for example, microchips, we don't even know how they're made. We don't know how microchips are made. And now Ford has to shut down their entire truck line because they don't know how to make microchips. These are major questions to ask. How do airplanes fly? We told it's just aerodynamics, even though they fly right through storms just fine. There's clearly a suppressed technology occurring on every level of our society here. And this is not the height of technology we're living in. This is more of a dystopian reality that we're all so, keen on.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And when we find out more and more about how jets are flying, and they may not even be running off of the jet fuel like we think they are. It's insane, some of the technology that they're hiding from us. But I want to go back for a second to the mud flood and the buildings. Do you have any kind of, what's the best evidence that you may be able to share with us of these buildings that may have existed pre-flood that they may have just dug out? I know that they have examples pretty much across the globe, right?
Yeah, I'm just getting best proof. There are so many researchers on this that have gone way beyond anything I'm going to do. If you type in Google and images mud flood, you'll at least find half a dozen pictures which show what they're talking about. What you're looking for is buildings with doors and windows below ground. Doors and windows should never ever exist below ground. There's no reason to do that. So that so many buildings exist with such a thing has to be explained. You also find some control opposition mud flood topics, which will say, this location in Haiti really did get flooded by a volcano. Yes, we do know that one because that one has reference to what happens. It wasn't a covered up memory. It was remembered as a volcano. So
yeah. Right on. That's very interesting. So is there any buildings in particular that you kind of have reference to that you know of, or any sites or places?
Let me take a look at my folder real quick.
And while he does that, is there any other questions that you had, October?
I have a lot of questions. We don't have enough time to cover all of them. But
now, before, just real quick, when approximately do you believe this mud flood occurred? How many 100, 200 years ago?
I'm pretty sure it was 1816 to 1860, roughly 40 years.
Okay.
That's my estimate. So here's a little photo, Temple of Artemis in Turkey. You can see how like pillars are underground here. Every time they excavate these ruins, they're always buried. A much better example actually is Jerusalem. Let me see if I can pull that photo here. I'm gonna go through. Okay, this is the White House. Sorry, give me 1 second.
Yeah, no worries.
There. Jerusalem. Yeah. All right. So, like my whole family lives in Israel, and I've been to Israel many times in my life. I'm very familiar with Jerusalem, and we're told that this is this ancient city that it's the oldest. Actually, it's the oldest city in human civilization. That's what they tell us. But it obviously experienced some kind of mud flood event. When I went there, I noticed that the shop owners are constantly excavating below their shops. They're finding ruins of an older civilization below the locations that you can walk in. So
that's all over the world. I mean, you're talking London, New York, right. Edinburgh. Every major city has catacombs or cities they built on top of.
Right. And so the answer is, the answer normally would be, the official answer is that they just build on top of the ruins of their old buildings. But if you ask any builder, does any builder in history do that? Is that heard of? No, it's not. You take down the structure and you build from the foundation.
So not really. I mean, I'm sorry, but if you go to Machu Picchu and there's other sites like that around the world, there are lots of ancient sites that have been they've left.
Well, I think they did that more out of respect towards the previous civilization, from what we're told.
Oh, they would do that. They should do that. Yes.
Now this, I don't think they would have respect for the previous civilization, so they would just, But it is interesting.
Right, and this one you can see the actual building was covered up to a really high level, and then it was excavated. If they can excavate, then they will, but sometimes they can't. Apparently, Paris is considered a mud flood location because there's a huge basement below the Eiffel Tower. There's a suggestion that the Eiffel Tower has been rebuilt. That wasn't built when they said it was, that it was rebuilt from the version that Napoleon had built in the first place. Got some more buildings. See if we got anything interesting.
So these mud floods, so it wasn't like the Great Deluge where the entire earth was supposedly flooded, and you're talking like these are like targeted areas where the mud flood was unleashed to cover up a general population, and also a well-known history of that population at the time.
Right. The biggest target was Siberia. If you look at Siberia today, it's a huge wasteland, gets negative 60 degrees, and pockets explode in the ground, 10 meters wide. No one knows why. Just huge pockets explode in the ground over there. Is a rot territory, is rendered, it has been destroyed. We could say, it's totally natural or something like that. But there's this memory of this Tartarian Rus horde empire that's now being pushed by the Russian government. They started in 2014 when we did all of our psyops on them. They took over Crimea and they started pushing back against Western propaganda by releasing these maps in 2014. So if these maps are true, if they ever existed, then something happened since to those locations to make it to the Siberia we know today. And that location has been completely destroyed. So real quick, the Ring of Fire here, I want to point out, we're told that this is how the continents combined and so forth. But the theory that, let me pull up a different photo here.
You're talking the theory that all the continents were together at one point?
In Saturnian cosmology, the Earth actually grows in size and then shrinks later. So there's a reason why the continents all used to fit together. The Earth grew. It's called expanding Earth theory. That one's been around for a long time. As far as those continents causing volcanoes, I'm just going to say that's not a good reason for volcanoes. It can't be that the continents that open up now and again by accident and that we have regional volcanoes. Instead, the Electric Universe people have suggested that these locations are actually lightning scarred, especially Western America, throughout Utah and Arizona. You got desert that's been lightning scarred, not by heat, but by lightning, and that the ground melted and formed all these loops and weird shapes in Utah, amazing, red landscapes that people visit. So this event, like I said earlier, if this mud flood event led to the creation of the Grand Canyon, if the Grand Canyon was created 200 years ago in this tremendous lightning scarring, then we know where all the mud came from that hit the rest of the earth. It was dug up by this tremendous energy, and it was it was just dumped everywhere else. The question is, why would the people who did this event possibly want to destroy so much land? Why would they want to leave mud flood behind? Isn't that evidence of their crimes? And this question, it still has to be answered. My answer for that question is that the mud flood event, as we know it, was unintentional. It was not something that anyone wanted to happen. It was an accident, and it happened as a result of Mars shooting Earth with a directed energy weapon, destroying all of those enemies of Napoleon one by one. Every region carving out islands, carving out the Bering Strait so that you can't walk across it anymore, and all of that heat did not dissipate from the Earth. It stayed there. It built up. That's what heat does. You can't destroy heat or get rid of it. And after a while, underneath the Earth, we had a secondary discharge. Secondary discharge is something, again, the electric universe people have described. When the Earth heats up too much, it discharges from inside, from the ground, up into the sky. It's the memory of the Chinese dragon is actually this lightning scar searching the Earth and destroying everything it sees. So I got this theory from electric universe people. The only thing that we disagree with is they think it happened in antiquity, and I believe that the rendering of Western America could have happened in the mud flood event 200 years ago.
Wow. So you think that the Russian government may know about this true history, and they're kind of giving us little breadcrumbs?
The Russian government, 100 years ago, represented the worst government we've ever seen with Bolshevik communism. It did horrible things in Europe and eventually fell apart in the 90s. Since the 90s, Russia has not been much of a government. It's sort of like a preyed-on country where everyone's taken their territory. And they've recently gotten their act together. And it seems to me that one of the ways that they fought back against Western infiltration was to release their maps and archives that they have in the Kremlin. They have all that stuff. And they're going to use it as a counter weapon. They're going to say, no, you guys are lying. And what have we seen from the West our entire lives? We've seen Russophobia. They've done us in movies and everything that these Russians cannot be trusted, do not talk to them, etc.
For sure. Yeah, so, it would make sense. Go ahead.
I'm going to go back into anthropology a little bit. What about like hominids like Neanderthals and Australopithecus, that roamed, the Earth 2.5 million years ago, and Neanderthals, I think, 40,000 years ago, that lived on the Earth, Denisovans, at the same time that humans did. And I'm giving you the historical timeline, not
no, that's all good.
So all of those, are you saying they didn't really exist because we have bones and skulls, or you're saying that they did exist, but that has nothing to do with Tartaria? There were just other creatures roaming the world.
Oh, I'm just saying that they changed the date. That's it. Those bones are real, but they changed the date. You can say the bone is a fossil from 1 million years ago, but fossils can be created by lightning. Fossilization is instantaneous. It's a lightning effect. The petrified forest might have been created by lightning strikes. If that's the case, again, electric universe theory, they say that that's the case. And Sapphire projects, go look it up, have reproduced lightning petrification in a laboratory. So they're not making it up. They reproduced it. They've shown that bones and everything can be made into fossils in a laboratory or in a lightning strike. But more to the point, who are the Neanderthals? So they are the Aborigines. Every time we hear about the colonists in places like America and in Australia, we always hear about the races that were there before. And those races were always lied about. They're always given false origin stories and so forth. And like I said before, one of the big tricks of redacting history is pushing your own crimes into the past. If the Neanderthals were all wiped out naturally by disease or something 1 million years ago, then it's not our fault that the Aborigines have all been wiped out in Australia in the last 200 years. See what I'm saying? They pushed their crime way into the past so that no one would suspect them in the present.
Well, if anybody really wants to know too about the orphan theory, it's very well known that orphan ships were sent to Australia from England. In fact, I actually know somebody who is whose ancestor was on one of them, and it is a crying shame what they did to those children. But that is something that you can check out. There's a tiny little bit, vestige of history with that. So
yeah.
It does have a little bit of validity as far as the theory goes. When we know modern, we can look back and we can trace, that actually did happen at some point in time. But it's it's an interesting theory, and I am definitely going to look into it more.
Yeah, so this stuff is so hard to kind of validate because they have lied about everything in our history, and most of the things we have learned growing up is through falsehoods, and history is written by our victors. So we have to go through this stuff, and I'm glad, people like yourself are doing this research and bringing these alternative ideas to us. I think it's super important, and I want to thank you, and keep it up, man. Keep going down those deep rabbit holes, and we're going to have you back on and discuss this again in the future.
Absolutely.
Yeah, before you head out, let everyone know where they can find your stuff, social media, if you got any websites, all that good stuff.
Yeah, just go to paradigmthreat.net and you can find our Discord link. And in there we have a pretty thriving community. A lot of people joining lately, sharing a lot of stuff and debating everything. It's been great. So come check out our Discord.
I do have one question more.
Please, go. No, go ahead.
So we live in really bizarre times. So do you think that there is another attempt at a reset right now?
Yeah, I believe the date was 2016 on February 16th. Just like Bill Murray said in Ghostbusters 2, he wasn't kidding. And the idea was that if they could repeat the last 100 years of history from the reset of 1816 and 1916, which was World War I, then they can literally predict the future of the next 100 years. And they can sort of see where their flaws were in the past and correct them on a timeline, which gives them the immense power to predict the future. This is the only real way to predict the future, is by hiding the past from everyone else and then forcing them to repeat it.
Well, there is a reason that the phrase, history is written by the victors was actually coined. And I think that that's important for anybody who's listening to the show that I have to admit, when I first heard this theory and stuff, I was like, oh, Jesus, another figure, I was like, this is
another one.
Yeah. I mean, come on, we're inundated now with, and because of the invent of the internet and constant and instant communication, there's a lot of false narrative out there. And I'm not going to use misinformation, but we have to be careful of where we, look to get our information and, who we really put our trust and faith in. Because there was a meteorologist in the 19th century that actually came up with Pangea, the theory of that all the continents were connected. And don't ask me his name because I'm terrible with names, but and he was laughed at and scoffed, and all these geologists and historians and anthropology was a budding science at the time, were just thought he was crazy, and then after he died, he was vindicated, because in the 30s and 40s, the scientific community came out and said, hey, gee,
Makes sense.
They actually do fit together like a puzzle, and this probably did happen. And then they had geological evidence of a cataclysm that made that continental drift happen. So who knows?
Yep. All our science is like that. Yep.
For sure. Well, Ari, thank you so much again. We'll definitely be having you back on sometime in the future.
Absolutely. This was a lot of fun, guys.
Thank you, Chris. Awesome. Thanks. Nice to meet you, Ari.
You too, October. We'll see you around.
Until next time, everyone, have an excellent evening. We'll be talking again tomorrow.